Right, hi there. So I thought I would do this video very quickly, just as a kind of half hour, maybe it won't take that long, just going through the micro mock exam and looking at some answers, giving you some exam advice, exam technique advice, answer advice, content advice if we need it. So if you've got your mock paper, you probably want the question paper and your own script in front of you. Pause me and do that now, and then we'll look to go through it. So I've got it on the screen in front of me. Unfortunately, I can't share, but I do have this whiteboard screen where I can show you any diagrams that I might be drawing. So the first question then was about gold prices. And most people did this absolutely fine. I think for those people that it went wrong, maybe you'd left this till the last question of the booklet and perhaps just didn't appreciate some of the changes that were going on with regards to price and quantity. So the data shows you that the price has gone up, and it also shows you that the quantity being demanded, the monthly sales, has also gone up. Now, if I take the questions in reverse order, going B rather than A, all we wanted for B was really a demand curve shift from D1 to D2, put your supply curve in there, and then you've got to show the changes in the price level and also the quantity being demanded, which have both increased. Make sure you label it. It doesn't have to be price of gold, although preferably it should, and then also your quantity. Now, most people got 2 out of 2 for that. Where people went wrong is perhaps they didn't have the labels, or perhaps they just made an error in which curve to shift. Now, how do you know which curve to shift? Well, there is only one way in which you can shift the supply and demand diagram that will give you both a price change and a quantity change. For example, if you show a supply increase, for example, I'm just going to do in that little corner there, whilst the quantity has increased from Q1 to Q2, okay, the price has actually gone down. So that would be wrong, and I'd give you 0 out of 2. So this is the only possible explanation of events. The demand must have increased. Then we go to A, so can you explain one possible reason? Now, I don't expect you to know very much about the gold market in particular. You don't have to give an accurate reason. It's just a hypothetically a possible reason. Now, the problem here is it's out of 2 marks, so it's not enough to say that the demand has increased. You've got to give me a reason why it's increased. So the best answers were things like income has gone up, but again, that's not enough. So just to say income has gone up on its own doesn't get you more than 1 out of 2. You've got the factor, you've got AO1 mark, but you haven't got the AO3 mark because you've not developed it enough to explain why it's made the change. So a better answer would be an increase in income, and therefore there is an increase in the quantity demanded because this is a normal good, or this is a luxury good. Again, other people talked about things like seasonal changes, and particular in India, for example, in particular festivals, there is this huge surge of demand for gold, and particular gold jewelry. So that might have increased demand. Or other people talked about changes in fashion trends or vlogging. And again, I'm perfectly happy to accept that. I think it's probably not true, but I'm perfectly happy to accept it because it's a possible explanation. Maybe a very high profile social media vlogger has decided that they're going to talk a lot about gold. It's a good investment, and therefore other people have done it. Oh, another one that gave a lot of people talked about the COVID pandemic. People are losing confidence in other assets, and they see gold as a very safe asset, so therefore the demand has gone up. But you see, with all of those, there's at least kind of a chain of analysis, and it's not just the identification of a point, it's at least expanding on that point to say why the demand has gone up. For part C then, the answer is A, that's an AO1 mark. If you don't understand that one, then make sure you go through your negative externalities diagram, and hopefully that will show you why the answer is the social costs are bigger than the private costs. Question number 2. Now, it's an interesting question too, but in the sense that it's just a product you've never heard of, and this is really one of the key skills about economics. I'm going to put you in situations, talking about products you've never heard of, countries that you've never talked about in class, and you just have to rely on your economic knowledge to help you solve the problem. So here we're told that essentially these are substitute goods. A actually doesn't rely on any of that. A just tells you that there is a bumper harvest of this thing called sorghum. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, which is a cereal grain with which we use to make this particular alcohol. And if this is a bumper harvest, how will this affect the price of alcohol? It's not enough just to say the price of alcohol goes down. What you have to tell me is why the bumper harvest of sorghum would lead to the price of this alcohol going down. And the truth is, you didn't need the diagram, but the truth is that we know this is happening in the sorghum market, that the supply curve is shifting to the right, because that's what a bumper harvest is, and that is decreasing the price of sorghum. Because the price of sorghum is going down then, which is a raw material, which is a key ingredient for the actual alcohol, the cost of production must be falling for the alcohol itself. So it is the same diagram, but for slightly different reasons. This one is because there is a bumper harvest in the actual grain. This one is because the costs of production have gone down. And I really wanted to reward people with 2 out of 2 for the people that kind of talked about the costs of production for this particular brand of alcohol going down. So as well as after. C, explain the likely numerical value of XED. Well, for the two marks here, I needed you to say that it was positive, but I also needed you to say that it was probably bigger than 1, and that's because they are close substitutes. An explanation is exactly that, they are close substitutes, but if you're saying that they are close substitutes, you can't just say that it's positive, because of course if a good A and good B had positive 0.1, that wouldn't make them close substitutes. So you have to say not only that they're positive, but it is a figure that is larger than 1. One person actually said that it's likely to be between 0 and 1, and the reason for that is that there's brand loyalty for one of the products. Now, I've got no idea on this, but that seemed like a very fair explanation, so I gave that person 2 out of 2. With C, with something like C, just draw the diagram. Okay, so you know that one of these products, good A, has decreased its price. Well, that means that people will buy more of that good. They're therefore going to buy less of the other good. Demand is going to decline for product C, product B, sorry, what am I talking about? Now you can have a look at the impact on consumer and producer surplus. So consumer surplus was here, producer surplus was there. Now at this new equilibrium, consumer surplus is here and producer surplus is here. In both cases, it's gone down. So the answer is D. My advice for questions like that, spend the 2 minutes, not even 2 minutes, the 20 seconds that it takes to draw the diagram and see for yourself what happens with consumer and producer surplus. Okay, question 3. Explain why there is no opportunity cost when the country moves from X to A. If you'd have just given me a definition of opportunity cost, that's probably good enough for 1 mark. Opportunity cost are the benefits foregone of the next best alternative. So why is there no opportunity cost when we move from X to A? Because we're getting an increase in wine, but we are not giving up any cotton. And it's really that phrase at the end, or that key component at the end, that I really need. We're not giving anything up. Now, it is true to say that the reason we're not giving anything up is because we were inefficient, and now we've gone to a point on the PPF which is absolutely efficient, at full capacity. But that's not explaining why there is no opportunity cost unless you've got some sort of sentence in there that says, and we're not giving anything up. Even if you just read off or came up with your own figures for the graph and said, well, we've gained all this wine and cotton stayed the same, that's good enough. Yeah, we haven't given anything up. So it was kind of an implicit or an explicit explanation that we hadn't given any cotton up. Assume that the economy is now on point A. What happens if there is division of labor? Okay, division of labor is this idea that we can set up a production line. We can give everybody a specialized skill in that particular production of cotton or wine or whatever it is. And as a result of that, we get more efficient. We can make more things, we can make more output of that particular product. And in the question, it says it's both wine and cotton. So actually what I was looking for you to do is an outwards shift of the PPF. The fact that I said it started at point A was a bit of a red herring, okay? There's nothing in that. But it did make it very clear because some of you are very keen to do that. Now that is a reallocation of resources. Now there's a very similar question to that, which would be something like, if I reallocated labour from wine towards cotton, what would that look like on a PPF? And that would be that one. But the question is, what is the impact of division of labour? So this was a question that was targeting whether or not you knew what division of labour was. Division of labour, again, is the idea of setting up a production line, people with specialist skills along that production line, and therefore productivity increases for both products. So we have a parallel shift outwards in both wine and cotton. Multiple choice C then, a downward sloping PPF, okay, which hopefully you had a look at during your course. What is the explanation for that? Now look, A and B were just complete red herrings. A, the law of diminishing marginal utility, is the reason why the demand curve slopes downwards. That's another downward sloping line, but that's the demand curve. The real balance effect, well, that's the reason why the aggregate demand curve is sloping downwards. But I wasn't asking you why those two things slope downwards. I was asking you why the PPF slopes downwards. So the answer is C. With C, all of the factors of production are perfectly substitutable between wine and cotton, or whatever good B and good A are likely to be. Because however many good Y's you give up, there will always be the same increase in the number of good X's that you can now make. Basically, the opportunity cost is constant. So the answer is C. All right, section B then. So section B, in general, seems to cause a few problems. So we'll go through that now and try and work out where they came from. Not so much 4A, actually. 4A was done pretty well. There was a relatively straightforward maths question, A1. Calculate how many times larger the average house price in Oxford was compared to the average wage. Well, those figures are in extract A. So all you needed to do was do 558,800 divided by 39,700, and the answer is 14.10 if you're giving your answer to two decimal places. 4A2, again, really well answered. So the best answers were something like this. Normative statements are value judgments, things that can't easily be tested, subjective statements. And the best example of that from extract A was the opening phrase, it's often stated that house prices in Oxford are too high. I mean, that's a judgment, that's an opinion. We can't test whether something is too high. All we can do is we can make a value judgment and think that it feels too high. Positive statements, on the other hand, are factual statements, but don't make the mistake that they have to be true. No, positive statements just have to be testable. So they may be false statements, but statements of facts that I can then go and test and prove them not to be true. Okay, and then there are loads of examples of them in extract A. So, for example, the fact that there is a statement there saying in 2020 the average wage in Oxford was 39,700. Well, you can test that. You can go and get the data and you can do the calculation and you can work that out. But there are 3 or 4 other examples in that extract as well. Okay, 4B, using the data, examine the view that buying a house and renting a property are strong substitutes. Okay. The vast majority of you have the exam structure, the answer structure, absolutely done very, very well. But for those that don't, remember that once we get to this point and beyond, I'm essentially expecting one particular question structure, answer structure. Point 1, an evaluation. Point 2, and an evaluation. And if your answer is not set out like that, you're then making the examiners work very hard and very difficult, okay? And that's not something that you want to particularly do in an exam, okay? The harder work that you make for the examiner, the less likely it is that they're going to reward you for the best marks. So the reason we do this, the reason that I really stress this from the beginning, is not because I think that's how all answers in economics forever should be answered. But this is an easy way of just making sure that we have ticked all of the boxes that we need to tick to show that the examiner that we have covered all of the things that we need to cover in the easiest way for him or her to read, because we want to make life easy for the examiner. When it's an 8 mark question, and this is always the question I get from students, what's the difference between an 8 mark and a 10 mark and a 12 mark and a 15 mark? Well, the honest answer is, it's just the level of detail that you go into in your points and your evaluations. And it is absolutely true to say, in an 8 mark question, you only really need 8 sentences, maximum 9. Okay, it should be taking you no longer than 8 or 9 minutes to write. And it's very clear that some of you are writing as much, if not more, for your 8 markers as you were for your 12 markers, and that can't be right. That can't be right. So it's a little bit counterintuitive, but you need to write less. You only need to write 8 or 9 sentences for that B. And we can have a look at this in class. Ultimately, the question is about, are these two things, good A and good B, strong substitutes? So it's testing your knowledge. Do you know what a strong substitute is? Well, actually, there was a previous question in the multiple choices that should have led you to knowing what a strong substitute is. But it's really, do you understand what they are, and can you apply them to the scenario? And I think there's loads that you can say. So, for example, they both satisfy the same want and need, shelter. Okay, they provide that same want and need, buying a house, renting a property. But then we need to think of an evaluation. Is that always true? Well, there's a bit in the data that says actually sometimes people buy houses as an asset. They don't buy them to live there. Okay, and similarly renting. Well, maybe I'm only in town for the next 6 months. Maybe I've got a short-term contract, and so therefore, why would I buy a house with all the faff that goes with buying a house? I just want to rent a property. I want to go in and I want to live there for 6 months and then I want to leave. So maybe they don't actually perform the same function for the same people. Other things that we could have said, we could have talked about the idea that, well, when the buying of a house goes up, actually that makes renting more attractive. Or vice versa. If renting goes up in price, then buying a house surely becomes more attractive, because why would I spend so much money renting a house and not getting an asset at the end of it? Whereas if I buy a house, I'm still spending, almost the same amount of money, but actually I'm getting a house at the end of it rather than getting nothing. Now, just be very careful in that. That works as an explanation, but what doesn't work is you just saying they are close in price. So some people said buying a house has a mortgage of about £700, and renting a property, if I'm looking up, just a room is about £500. They're very close in price. Well, that in and of itself doesn't mean that they're strong substitutes. I mean, just to give you a brief example, this hand gel and this pen are probably quite close in price, but that doesn't make them substitutes. Just because something is close in price doesn't make them a substitute. So you've got to be a little bit careful in the way in which you articulate what you're saying. It's not true to say that they're substitutes because they're close in price. What is true to say is that when the price of one of these things is likely to go down, or does go down, it's likely that the quantity demanded of the other thing goes up, and that's what makes them some strong substitutes. Remember, when you're doing this structure, if point 1 is you arguing that they are strong substitutes, point 2 doesn't also need to make that argument. Point 2 can be, actually, they're not very strong substitutes. So maybe for example, the fact that when you're renting a property, you can't decorate it. You're not allowed to put your own pictures up. You can't paint the walls your own color. You're just stuck with it. Whereas in buying a house, actually, you can do whatever you want to a house. You can put an extension on. You can paint all the walls black if you particularly want to. And therefore, maybe they're not strong substitutes. So point 1 and point 2 don't have to be arguing in the same direction, if you understand. Let's have a look at C. Assess the likely micro impact of reducing stamp duty land tax. Ultimately, the test was, can you draw the diagram and can you interpret the diagram? That's the diagram. Okay, it's an ad valorem tax, so therefore it's a pivot change, but it's coming this way because we're removing the tax. Economics says, the diagram that I've taught you says, that if you do that, the price will come down and the quantity demanded goes up. And a lot of people did that very, very well. So well done you. What a lot of people did is started talking about the demand curve shifting outwards. And that's really the point of the question in a way, because I am assessing whether or not you remember the difference between the movement along the line, this equilibrium to that equilibrium, or the shift of the line. And if you think back all the way to week 2, week 3 economics, we spent quite a lot of time talking about the difference between the movement along the demand curve and the shift of the demand curve. If the price comes down like it is here, it's a movement along the demand curve, and there is no need to shift the demand curve like that. Okay, the rest of the question says, what is the impact on the consumers and the government? So it's very neatly already kind of signposting you to how you need to do the 0.1, eval 1, 0.2, eval 2. 0.1 should just be, all right, here's my diagram. Well, look, for consumers, brilliant, price has come down, they're likely to be spending more, and if you really want to, do consumer surplus. Consumer surplus was here, now consumer surplus is all of that. So consumer surplus has gone up, we've seen an increase in that much. Then you're looking for things like evaluation. Well, maybe because since this is 2021, this is kind of latest information, it doesn't really matter if the price is going down. There's not a lot of consumer confidence in the world, and therefore maybe people aren't really buying very many more houses. Okay, so maybe this isn't a really big change. And I'm sure you can think of others. Point 2 has to be about the government. Okay, the question is asked you, what's the effect on consumers and the government? So point 2 has to be about the government. You have to say something about the government. If you now go and tell me about producers and producer surplus, that's all very interesting, but it doesn't get you any marks. So you've got to talk about the government. Look, it's very obvious. If the government reduces a tax rate, then you would have thought the tax revenue should go down. And that's really all you need to say. The best answer might do something interesting with the diagram. You're going to need an original supply line here. And you can say something like, here is the original tax revenue, because you're all happy with drawing tax revenue boxes. And look, here is the new tax revenue. And that first box looks bigger than the last box. Okay, that really would have been a full mark answer. Okay, so tax revenue is likely to go down. Evaluation, well, that kind of depends on PED. Okay, because that's simply not true if price is elastic. When price goes down, there'll be an even more significant change on the quantity being demanded, and actually the tax revenue that the government sees might go up. Or there's another evaluation here, which is if people go and buy houses and they get on the housing ladder, then maybe in the future there's a wealth effect. Or there's something in the data that says actually if this stimulates the economy, as Rishi Sunak was intending to do, then actually the additional tax revenues that the government see in other areas of the economy will make up for the shortfall here. There's plenty of evaluations. D, discuss the view that the government should set a maximum price on properties for rent in a city like Oxford. All right, here's my recommendation for questions like this. Why would anybody suggest that this is a good idea? You've got to make the argument at the beginning of why this is a problem. So for me, the answer is, well, it's probably about income inequality, but some people did some really good stuff about negative externalities of homelessness, and some other people did some really good stuff about positive externalities of people that actually own a home. Okay, I don't really care, but I think it's a good idea for you to just tell me what the issue is, what the market failure is to begin with. Then that allows you to kind of analyze that diagram. Okay, remember with maximum prices, we've got to do it below the equilibrium. And what I'm showing here is with a maximum price, this is how many would be demanded, but this is how many would be supplied. And the problem with maximum prices is that actually it's likely to lead to a shortage, this idea of excess demand. There's not enough incentive for producers, or in this case landlords, to put their properties on the market because they're not getting enough of a return. Have a look at the mark scheme and tell me what you think about the possible answers for this question. Okay, on the one hand, rental properties in cities like Oxford are clearly very high. Use the data that says they're too high. Use your answer to 4A, or sorry, some sort of idea. You can use the average rental in Oxford, and you can use the average rental price in Oxford, and you can see how many multiples it is. It doesn't leave them with an awful lot of disposable income at the end. So on the one hand, reducing price seems like a good thing. On the other hand, if it creates a shortage, then that clearly isn't a good thing, because you've now actually reduced the amount of community surplus, for example, in the city. There are other arguments that we can make, but in terms of time, I'm going to press on to the essays. All right, essays. It was good to see that some of you did the essay first. I think the way in which we structured the exam this summer, it works. I'm not saying that forevermore that you should do the essay first, by the way, but I think because of the nature of this particular exam, it worked very well. There is a bit of exam technique in choosing your essay. So I would be saying that for this one, price elasticity of supply. I mean, look, there's a reason that I chose price elasticity of supply. It's quite often a topic that people find a bit tricky. They don't revise very much. So if you'd have revised price elasticity of supply, actually 6 was a bit of a gimme. Yeah, it was very easy. Whereas 5 is probably a little bit less obvious. But if you can't do 6, you can't do 6, so you haven't got a choice. But let's have a think about 6. 6 is the idea of price elasticity of supply. So it's the responsiveness of the quantity being supplied to a change in quantity, to a change in price. We know that as the price goes up, that gives an incentive to producers to produce more. So price elasticity basically tells us, can they produce that much more? They want to, but can they? It tells us about the shape of the supply curve. So basically, do we have an inelastic supply curve or do we have an elastic supply curve? The confusion that quite a few of you had, and it was quite a few of you, is that I wasn't asking you for reasons why the supply curve shifts. I'm asking you for reasons why the supply curve is either very steep or very shallow in gradient. Some of you also, when you look through your essays, you'll notice that some of you are talking about demand quite a lot of the time. And again, this is a common error. People are being asked a question about PES, but they end up talking about PED. So things like the number of alternatives or the percentage of income, that's a PED issue and not really a PES issue. Go back and have a look at the spec, and that will give you a list of factors that affect PES. So to give you a couple, we could talk about things like the amount of time that it takes to make this particular product. So traditionally speaking, agricultural goods take quite a lot of time to make. Okay, if you want to sell tomatoes, it's going to take you a few months to make a tomato. Whereas if it's a manufactured good, if it's like a pen, you would have thought there's a machine that could put this pen together in minutes. Okay, therefore, if the price of pens goes up, the factory can respond to that very quickly and it can produce a whole load of pens very easily. If the price of tomatoes goes up, I want to make tomatoes, but over the next couple of weeks, I can't. Okay, I'm going to have to wait months. So it's much more inelastic. Now, actually, I didn't mind if people just went through 3 factors that affect PES and just said for agricultural goods, they're more likely to be inelastic, so we can't store them. They take time. What else? Maybe it's a complicated process. Maybe there's specialized labor, whatever. Whereas for manufactured goods, it's much more likely to be elastic for all the other reasons. It's automated. It doesn't take very long. You don't really need specialized labor because you're doing it from machines. And give your examples, because the question does state using your own examples. So talk about things like tomatoes. Talk about things like machine manufactured pens. They want examples all the way through. So I didn't mind if you did that all the way through. The best answers, what I actually didn't expect, but some of you did this really, really well, was to sort of say, well, in general, agricultural goods are price inelastic in supply, but actually there's a few agricultural goods that probably aren't, okay? So for example, cress, that takes days to grow, it doesn't take months. And we're also getting to the stage in the world where new technologies come in, which makes it a lot quicker to make tomatoes in greenhouses and fertilizers and those sorts of things. So it's not true that every agricultural good is inelastic. And it's also not true that every manufactured good is elastic. So for example, a ship is a manufactured good, and that will take months because that's highly complicated, takes a lot of different people. Or you could talk about, scarcity of raw materials to make a particular product. If raw materials are scarce, then actually it's going to take time to make that manufactured product or not. So those are some of the ideas there. 5 then, Should school meals be provided for free by the government? This is a little bit like the NHS one that I set you just before the exams. Should healthcare be set for free? And if you remember my advice for that one, I said always start with the market failure. What is the market failure going on here? Well, almost all of you told me that the market failure was positive externalities, although there were a couple of you that tried to claim that it was something else. But I think the answer here really is that this is a positive externalities question. And you've got to be clear why it's a positive externalities question. What is it about having a school meal that will lead to external benefits for the third party? And it's probably the idea that when we're better fed in school, we're more engaged in the learning process, we're therefore more likely to do better at school, and therefore we're going to get on to better skills, we'll have better skilled jobs, we'll have better wages, we'll contribute to tax revenue, but we've got to make that very clear, okay? And then it's essentially the same question as the one I set you about healthcare, which is, should we therefore provide them for free? Well, the problem with providing them for free is that we're not at the socially optimum level, but actually we go far beyond that, and there is kind of an idea of a further misallocation of resources, or this idea of government failure. It's also incredibly expensive, and actually, maybe the government would be better off putting their money somewhere else. That's the idea of opportunity cost. Maybe just because the government is funding it doesn't necessarily mean the quality is going up, okay? And actually, maybe this would be better provided for by the private sector where there's competition, and therefore the quality of the product might actually go up. In terms of whether school meals should be provided, well, maybe there's a quality issue. Private sector is better at quality, perhaps. Maybe there's an income inequality issue, and maybe it's not fair, okay, that low-income households for whom the marginal utility would be greater for school meals aren't able to afford them in the private sector, and therefore we should provide them for free. So that question, I think, was done best when people rooted their argument in that idea of market failure of positive externalities. So look, I hope that's helpful. We will go through it in class at some stage, but if you take a look at the video and have a look at your own answers against mine, hopefully you'll have some idea of how you might improve going forward. Okay, thanks very much. See you in class.